Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on our leaders. Today we will be covering Rodrigo Duterte from the Philippines and Cyril Ramaphosa from South Africa. In terms of forming pairs, I hadn't mentioned this earlier, but generally speaking, I'll be looking for leaders of nations with similar GDP levels. I think that's a good place to start forming pairs. I think it's unfair to compare a country with a massive GDP such as the United States to one with a much smaller GDP. Otherwise, I will also be looking for leaders with generally similarities or differences in terms of leadership style, and I think that will also be evident in this video too. Particularly speaking, South Africa is the 35th largest country according to GDP, according to the International Monetary Fund, and the Philippines is number 36 according to the International Monetary Fund. So they're also pretty similar in that regards as well. Quite different in population, however, but still I think these two nations fit to be compared, and I think the leaders actually have many important differences and also many interesting similarities. So without further ado, we'll begin with Rodrigo Duterte. So Rodrigo Duterte, also referred to as Didong or Roddy, and more recently, according to some newspapers, as the Punisher. He is a Filipino politician and the 16th and incumbent president of the Philippines. He's the first Mindanao, an individual from the southern Philippines, the second largest island actually. But he was the first president from Mindanao. He's the chairperson of the PDP Laban party, which is the leading political party. He's took office at the age of 71, making him the oldest person to ever to become president in the Philippines. Previously the record was held by Sergio Osmeña at age 65, who held office from 1944 to 1946. So even then, his closest competitor was much earlier in terms of history, 1944 to 1946, at the much different time, but also he didn't hold power for very long. So it's very interesting that this individual, Duterte, has attained the office at such an older age and held it for so long as well. And a couple other quick comparisons. Donald Trump, who is currently the president of the United States, attained office at the age of 70, so actually 1 year younger than Duterte when he attained office. He is now 73 as of today. And Bernie Sanders is running for office, and he is 78 years old, so he would be older than Duterte when he found himself in office. So Duterte was born in Masin, which is in southern Leyte, and he studied political sciences at Lyceum of the Philippines. This is named after, actually, a school named after Aristotle's Lyceum. If you had seen my video on Aristotle, he formed a school called Lyceum. Also, the French word lycée, which is a school, is also founded upon this word. And it's actually one of the only universities where the founder was a president. So the third president of the Philippines actually founded this school. And this school was in Manila. However, it's not particularly highly ranked, and I think that's an important distinction to be made. The top universities, one might consider, it's obviously up to dispute, but many consider De La Salle University or University of Santo Tomas to be the top universities in the Philippines. So I think an important distinction or comparison could be drawn to, for example, Boris Johnson, who we previously covered, went to Eton Preparatory School, arguably one of the top preparatory schools in not only the United Kingdom, but perhaps the world. And he also went to Oxford University, where obviously his education gave him a certain amount of clout, but I don't think the same could be said for Duterte. But we'll see that his family did obviously help. He studied law at San Beta College of Law in Manila. Once again, not one of the top law schools in the school. Often people consider the University of the Philippines or University of San Carlos to be the top law school. So once again, the same argument stands there. He was a lawyer and prosecutor in, actually his father was a Cubano lawyer as well. And not only that, his father's name was Vincent, but he was also, firstly to talk about his past upbringing. So his father was a Cebuano, which is the largest ethnic group in the Philippines, which I think is important to note because Duterte is considered to be a populist, and obviously if you're a populist, that means the majority of the population, or at least the biggest group, supports you. Parallels could be seen to someone such as Pericles, but I don't think that would have been very easily achieved if he had come from a less prominent ethnic group. However, his mother was a Marano, of Marano descent, and which is actually a predominantly Muslim ethnic group. So actually, his mother could be considered a little bit more of a minority. However, I don't think Duterte is considered a minority in the Philippines, nor does he consider himself one. Within, just to speak a little bit more about that ethnic group, the Marano, they speak the Danao languages, where there's about 2.5 million people. But however, there are three subsets of the Danao language, one of which there's 1 million speakers, 1 million speakers, and 0.25 million speakers. So it's a pretty small, or at least a smaller ethnic group, and especially them being predominantly Muslim probably had some implications on his stance on the terrorist group equivalent that later affects his political life. His father died in 1968 when he was only 57 years old, which is pretty young, and Duterte was only 23 at the time, which is not that young, but I think when one's father dies, that's when they're ultimately given sort of absolute independence over their life. So at the age of 23, I assume, got the feeling that he was firstly quite alone, but also quite open in terms of his options. His father was actually not only a lawyer, but he was the mayor of Danao, Cebu, which is, and also provincial governor of the Davao province when it was back in the time when it was undivided. His cousin was also mayor of Danao for Danao, Cuba, Cebu, for 3 years, and his uncle was also the mayor for 2 years. So politics definitely ran in his family. Similarly, other political families such as the Durano and Amendra's clan are considered relatives of his family. So he came from, despite his education not going to the top schools, politics definitely runs through his veins and definitely had a lot in establishing his not only early clout but aggregate clout. During his upbringing, his family moved. He was originally born in Masin, his father's hometown, and then to his father's hometown in Danao, which he was also mayor of. He moved around until the age of 4 years old. He spent some time in Mindanao briefly and Visayas, back and forth. And however, in Davao region, they sort of settled in 1952, and his mother retired, and his father entered politics, which he would remain in for 16 years as mayor and also as provincial governor at one point as well. Due to all the movement of his families from town to town or city to city, he was expelled twice during misconduct in high school. And another, I think, a very important thing to note on was that he was sexually abused by a priest as a minor. He was a Catholic priest actually called Father Mark A. Actually, I probably shouldn't say his name, but we'll call him Father Mark. But he was famous for. It had been revealed that he had also sexually abused many other individuals. He spent most of his time in China and the Philippines. Duterte was asked why he did not come forward with this when he was younger, and it said firstly he feared authority. He shouldn't be calling out priests, but also he was getting expelled from school, so he wasn't exactly a perfect child. So I don't think he felt it was right of him to expose this priest, despite his father being potentially political. So he didn't tell anyone, but eventually he exposed that. But I think it's important to note because I do think something like that does have a big implication on one's mannerisms and beliefs. So eventually additionally, so he went to law school, which was not not the top law school, but nonetheless, it was in Manila, which is the biggest city, which obviously granted him some, I guess, many friends. But during this time, he claimed that he shot a fellow student at a rally. It said that this student was bullying he and other students based on their ethnic Visayan origin. And some reporter, supposedly he told reporters that this student died, but some people dispute this, saying that it was just his friend Goko and him playing with a gun, and he accidentally fired him. Another friend said that the bullet just hit the ground. But I think the point is that Duterte wanted to. Firstly, I think a general bias that I will have throughout these videos is assume what these people say is true, because whether it's true or not, it represents their rhetoric or what they want to express. So in this case, throughout his life, he wants to express himself as someone strong and someone with the capacity for violence. And that's really what he wants to get at. Whether he actually did it or whether he didn't, it doesn't really matter too much. The quote I had the other day is, don't believe everything you read, but believe everything you hear or someone says, which is obviously not completely true in practice, but everything you read is often journalists who are giving their own take on certain articles and such. But when somebody actually says something, obviously people can be saying a lie, but I think there's a little bit more honesty in someone's spoken word than written word. Unless someone's writing like an autobiography or writing their own words, then the same honesty can be assumed. But nonetheless, I believe that he shot the guy. I don't think that's something that if it really was a lie, I don't think if he really wanted to prove it, I think he has the capacity to do it again. As we can see in his leadership style, I do think he definitely has the capacity for violence. He's considered a populist and a nationalist, and he has very vocal support for extrajudicial killings of drug users and other criminals. Human rights organizations have documented over 1,004 killings by death squads between 1998 to 2016, mostly drug users, petty criminals, and even children, supposedly. However, Duterte has on and off sort of denied this and accepted it. I think maybe the killing of children he obviously would deny, but he definitely advocates for the killing of criminals. The Office of Ombudsman of the Philippines closed an investigation in 2016 stating that no death squad did exist. So perhaps the Office of the Ombudsman, which is supposed to be impartial, is lying and corrupt, or perhaps really Duterte did not. But I do think, in my opinion, these killings have been going on, but to what extent Duterte has been involved in them is up to debate. But at least he advocates for them and does not disallow them. In fact, he does promote it through his rhetoric. He said, I personally killed criminal suspects as mayor of Davao, so he definitely advocates for it. But once again, with the shooting of a student, is that a lie as well? I think assume it's true. It's not like he's lying, saying that he's an overly good person. He's claiming that he has done evil. But during his time, however, Davao had the #1 murder rate and the second highest rape rate and the fourth highest index of crime back in 2010. However, after, perhaps through his work and through his crackdown on criminals, perhaps through death squads, in 2015 it was considered the 5th safest city, only after cities such as Osaka, Seoul, and Singapore. So I've never been to Davao, but if it is really as true as those other safe, extremely safe cities, well, to what extent can we assume that it was Duterte? I think we can assume quite a bit was done by him, because at least he did some pretty radical measures. Obviously killing by death squads and perhaps the extrajudicial killings is obviously wrong. It's always morally and ethically wrong to kill people, but to consider, just for in his defense, to consider what things would have been like had he not have done this, perhaps it could have still had the second highest rape rate and the highest murder rate. So a couple other disputes in, or actually getting back to his actual election. So in May 2016, he won the Philippine presidential election, winning 39%, beating four other parties, including Max Rosas of the Liberal Party, who held 23.5%, Senator Grace Poe holding 21.4%, and former VP J. Jomar Binay from the United Nationalist Party, who had 12%, and Senator Miriam Defensor of the United Nationalist Alliance, who had 12%, and the People's Reform Party, who had 3%. But nonetheless, although I think a 39% vote for him and his party in such a recent date of May 2016, obviously that's a big portion of the population, and the rest was pretty much evenly distributed throughout the other parties. So obviously he is a populist, and people are voting for him. You could make the argument that perhaps the elections are corrupt and the vote count is wrong, but nonetheless, he has been a good portion of people in the Philippines do undoubtedly support him. His campaign in this election was one where he promised to kill tens of thousands of criminals and end crime in 6 months, domestically, and supposedly they had counted up to 7,000 deaths already, and they even stopped counting. So he has perhaps been following through with his words in his presidential campaign, or presidential office, proving that he's sort of a similar sort of stance on criminals that he held when he was mayor of Davao. Obviously, domestically, his primary objective is to combat illegal drug trade, called in the Philippine drug war. The Philippine National Police claimed that 7,000 deaths as of January 2017 were already made, so that's a big portion of people, and I definitely do not think that is a good thing in any way, shape, or form. But perhaps, obviously, just to defend him, what would the state of the situation be without him? It's hard to say, so it's all speculation. But internationally, his policy has been, after criticisms from the UN human rights experts, he has threatened to withdraw Philippines from the United Nations, and he has sought closer ties with China and the African nations. He seeks to pursue an independent foreign policy, therefore sort of distancing it from the US and European Union and bringing closer ties to China and Russia. Particularly with respect to China, one of the biggest disputes going on is the South China Sea dispute. So the question of who has sovereignty over the South China Sea is up to debate. And right now, China's even going so far as to build islands. They're deploying military vehicles in the South China Sea. It's deterred by some Filipinos consider him not be taking a strong enough stance against Xi Jinping and the Chinese government, and I think this is a very important issue in that it sort of emphasizes that Duterte's toughness might be necessary when they have to go against such powerful leaders as China. Let's say, hypothetically, Rodrigo Duterte was an individual who did not have the capacity for violence, or he was a much weaker, an individual who appeared weaker on a political landscape. One might assume that maybe the South China Sea would already be undoubtedly completely Chinese. So, but nonetheless, it's interesting that he actually still wants to generally speaking, improve relationships with China. But I think that's firstly because perhaps they can get a better deal out of the South China Sea negotiations, but also just because if he plans on distancing himself from the US and the EU, he must choose a new ally, and that would be China or Russia. Some other issues that he has been charged with. He had some rape comments after Jacqueline Hamil, an Australian missionary, was raped in 1986 and over her corpse, and it came revealed in the 26 elections, he stated that he should have gone first. But one thing that he's obviously very characteristic of his nature is that he opens his mouth, but his defense was that he didn't mean it offensively, if that is at all possible. What he meant was to emphasize the brutality of the event, saying that I guess he was saying that perhaps it was inevitable, but I think a statement like that is very hard to defend, and I think it's more so indicative of his sort of loudmouthness and sort of vulgarity. In terms of terrorism, the Matut group, which is an ISIS-inspired group, and claimed the 2016 Davao bombing, he engaged in the after claiming martial law, declared the Battle of Marawi, which was the longest and largest urban battle in modern Philippine history. So obviously a very tough stance with respect to terrorism. Probably you could see parallels with his stance towards criminals and the drug trade. However, in his dialogues before, he was sort of I guess in a state of or aim for negotiation. He said, "I do not want to fight with you. I don't want us killing each other." And he cannot keep traveling just to speak, because each time when I turn around, there's killing. And then ultimately things broke out, and it led to a massive urban battle. But I don't think he has a particular bias, as you might see in some of the other countries. Some of the other countries where there is a Muslim minority, often they are very poorly or mistreated. I think Duterte, obviously his stance towards Islam or Muslim isn't perfect. He declared martial law against this group, but they did claim some bombings and they did engage in quite a bit of violence. But I think in his defense, his mother was of a minority group that was predominantly Muslim, so I don't think he has a particular bias against the Muslim people, but rather he just sort of through necessity had to engage in martial law and this urban war. So yeah, I guess we'll go to the quotes here, and then we'll talk about him more in the comparison. So it's just some brief overviews of the country. So the Philippines is a country of 104.9 million people, so a very large country, about the same in population as Russia, for example, is about in the 100 bracket. So it's a very big country. But the GDP is much, even actually Russia's GDP is not that very large, not too large, but GDP of 13.6 billion, putting it in 36th place in the global space, and an area of 300,000 kilometers squared, which is actually quite small, as it's mostly an island. Well, it's all built up of many different islands. So as for his quotes, love of country, subordination of personal interests to the common good, concern and care for the helpless and the impoverished, these are among the lost and faded values that we seek to recover and revitalize as we commence our journey towards a better Philippines. So I think some beautiful words and effective use of rhetoric. And yes, for every profanity, there's a story behind it. People should go beyond my cussing. So this is sort of a defense because, many of the biggest issues that he's had, for example, that with his comments on the rape, were just caused by just his words, and perhaps his stance on the extrajudicial killing of the criminals. Maybe it's just his words that are allowing it. Maybe he is not actually guiding this secret police squad, but maybe it's just his words that are allowing for this to happen. Gamble until you die, I do not care. So obviously this is from a different context, but he's it's just evidence of his harshness. He if other people want to take risks, that's up to them, but his stance stays the same. I slap people in public, especially erring policemen. I even challenged them to a duel. I am a gunfighter. So this is just, firstly, the stance on airing policemen is that he's tough within his own, or the actual government itself. So even within his own government, he's tough on them, which is obviously shows a bit of, I don't know, evenness in terms of temperament. However, he also always, throughout his whole campaign and throughout his whole life, wants to appear as someone strong. That's why he calls himself, I am a gunfighter. That's why he has claims that he has shot an individual and even killed criminals as well. If you're a public official, your life is an open book. So that is, I think, very true for this individual. There's, I think, partially you could see parallels to many other leaders, particularly that are emerging right now, that their words really today are, they can't lie about the things they say. Everything he says has been heard. Everything in his personal life is generally known. Another little anecdote, after he made the comments about the rape of the Australian girl, his daughter said she was raped as well, but she would still vote for her father, Duterte, which is obviously a little bit of, nepotism. It's her own father. But Duterte actually responded that she probably hadn't even been raped and was just a drama queen. So just I think he's also he's got a bit of humor, but obviously he has a capacity for upsetting people. But I do think that's a necessary feature of his leadership, and I think that if he were not so provocative, I don't think he would actually hold this seat of power, even if all of his policies and all of his efforts were the exact same. If he did not have the same provocativeness in terms of speech, I don't think he would be in the same position that he is in now. And we'll move on to Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. So Cyril Ramaphosa was born on November 17th, 1952. He is a South African politician and the fifth and current president of South Africa. In 2018, he succeeded Jacob Zuma. So he's actually a pretty new leader. He actually only just came into power, one could say. He was previously an anti-apartheid activist, a trade union leader, and he's also a quite successful businessman. He was deputy president of South Africa from 2014 to 2018, and he is the president of African National Congress, which is his party and the leading party, and he was elected to this position at the ANC National Conference in December of 2017. So he only just recently came into power within his own party as well. He was former chairman of the National Planning Commission, which is responsible for strategic planning of the country. And he served his first full term as president of the National Assembly on May 22nd, after ANC's victory in the 2019 South African elections, or general elections. So he pretty much just came into power. In 2020, which is even this year, that which I'm speaking, he became chairperson of the African Union, which is essentially the intergovernmental body governing of the Africa, similar to the EU, except without as much powers, one could say. He's a skillful negotiator and strategist, and he was ANC's chief negotiator in South Africa's transition into democracy. In 1994, with the National Party's Rolf Meyer, he contributed to the first fully democratic election in the country. He also built South Africa's largest trade union, the National Union of Mine Workers, which is also a hugely important act. So with respect to his early life, he was born in Soweto, Johannesburg, the 17th of November, 1952, as I had mentioned. He was the second of 3 children. His mother was named Erdmuth, and his father was Samuel, a retired policeman. He went to Tshilidzi Primary School, pardon me for the pronunciation, and then to Sekano Natone High School in Soweto, the region he was born. He went to Mfali High School, and he was elected head of the student Christian movement. So by high school, he was already sort of showed an affinity for politics and an ability for to be elected. He graduated from school in 1971, and after this he studied law at the University of the North in Limpopo province. It's now called the University of Limpopo. Once again, this is not one of the top universities in the country. However, one must take into account the situation at the time. This was during apartheid times. I think it was definitely much more difficult to have gone to a top university at this time, but also take into account his socioeconomic status. His family was not definitely not upper class, or at least not politically motivated as they were in Duterte's case. His father was a policeman, which is a very respectful job, but in many countries, the gateway into the top universities is through social standing. At university, he got further involved in student politics, joining the South African Students' Organization, SASO, and also the Black People's Convention, the BPC. Through sort of his involvement, he was imprisoned in solitary confinement for 11 months. So this was a result of he was forming pro-Frelimo rallies, which was a nationalist movement for independence from the Portuguese control during apartheid times. So under Section 6 of the 1974 Terrorism Act of 1967, he was sentenced to 11 months in solitary confinement, which is obviously extremely intense. Not only was he imprisoned, he was solitary confinement for 11 months. Is very intense, and that very much underlies how horrible the apartheid really was for simply holding a rally, which could just essentially be considered an act of free speech. Eventually, this act was removed in 1991, but this is obviously that was not very long ago that such a heinous act existed. In 1976, under the Terrorism Act, he was once again detained in John Vorster Square for following some civil unrest in Soweto province. So once again in prison. But after his release, he found work as a law clerk in Johannesburg and continued his legal studies at Johannesburg University, which is the largest university in South Africa. But once again, it was not or is not the top school for law, but it is obviously extremely highly rated. So he definitely had this obviously helped him in terms of his clout, but obviously given his background, it would have been difficult to have perhaps gone to some of the other schools, but Johannesburg University is, in all intents and purposes, a very, very great school. And he attained his degree in 1981. So this was when he was 29 or 30 years old, so obviously a little bit older to finally graduate and attain his law degree compared to Duterte, or compared to most individuals. I guess in the West, in North America, one receives their law degree a bit later. In some other countries, one can go directly and get their law degree directly after high school. However, 29, 30, he was already a little bit older to finally be entering into some work. He studied particularly legal theory as well. So his career began when he joined the Council of Unions of South Africa, the CUSA, as an advisor in the legal department. In 1982, CUSA suggested that he start a union for the mine workers, which he launched that same year, called the National Union of Mine Workers, and is now the largest union in all of South Africa. He became the first secretary of this union and did a keynote address for the formation of the Congress of the South African Trade Union, COSATU is the acronym, at the African National Conference for the African National Congress, which is the party that he would later join, where they met in Zambia. So through his involvement with the union, he was already starting to get connected with the political party. He was elected Secretary General of the African National Congress ultimately, but during his union membership, he grew, or during his involvement as secretary of the mining union, he grew the membership from 6,000 in 1982 when it started to over 300,000 in 1992, which includes nearly 50% of the total black workforce in the mining industry. And he also organized one of the biggest strikes as well. So once he got involved in the ANC, which he had sort of got associated with through his involvement with the unions, he obviously vehemently fought against apartheid, and at the national reception on the National Reception Committee, he fought for Nelson Mandela's release. Later, Nelson Mandela actually advocated for him becoming president. And through this, he eventually started to become, climbed up the ranks of the ANC, and he was ultimately found his first full term essentially this year after climbing through the ranks of the ANC. But through this time, he also got very heavily involved in business. He has an estimated net worth of 6.4 billion rand, South African rand, or the equivalent of 450 million US dollars, which is very, very rich for someone who came from a union background, which could be seen as a little bit counterintuitive. He previously held large ownership in McDonald's South Africa. He was the chair of the board of MTN, which is a telecom company, and on the board of Lonmin, which is a British mining company that has operations in South Africa. He's received accusations from benefiting illegally from a joint venture with Glencore, where he unfairly gained profits from coal deals with Eskom, but he denied this and was never found guilty. His son Andile was fined for 2 million rand for bribes from Bosasa for which was a protection company. So his son might be involved in some corruption, or maybe it's just a sort of crackdown on Ramaphosa himself by indirectly attacking his son. However, his son, I think many considered to have been guilty of this. The Marikana massacre on Lonmin territory, which he is the board of, was one of the worst strikes in recent history. It was the result of the 2012 strikes, and it resulted in a massacre. He believed the strikes that the workers were doing was dastardly criminal and needed concomitant action, but it ultimately ended up getting very violent. It was a horrible event, and he regretted this later, saying that they should have had a contingency plan in place. And I think this is a little bit, I guess, almost ironic, because he comes from a union background and he did not allow these strikes to happen. It's like he, as one who came from a union background and formed one of the biggest unions, one would think that he would be in support, generally speaking, of strikes. But perhaps because he had this background, he understood how perhaps maybe this was an unjust one. But nonetheless, he got in quite a bit of trouble for this. So he's ultimately now the chairperson of the African National Congress, and internationally he advocates for closeness and unity between South Africa, and obviously I think his goodness could be found from his fighting against apartheid, and his endorsement by Nelson Mandela. It obviously goes a very long way. He has 5 sons, and he's gone through 3 wives. Now his most recent wife is a daughter of a billionaire. But once again, I think just because he's gone through wives, I think one's personal life cannot be applied to one's political life, and just because one has had many divorces, that does not mean that they are not a good person, and does not mean that they have the capacity and are a great leader. He has a huge, luxurious mansion at the foot of the Lion's Head in Cape Town, which obviously one might be a symbol of, or is seen by some as a symbol of greed, but I don't think that at all we can discount his goodness. And I think the fact that he's earned profit is in fact indicative of the changes that have happened in South Africa after the apartheid regime went down. So I guess the biggest irony that could be seen in his career is his movement from a union supporter and a one who fought apartheid to becoming one who's so wealthy in a country that does still have a pretty large wealth gap. But nonetheless, I think he is a great person, and I think the things that he is doing in terms of bringing the African Union together is very important. But he's only just come into power recently, so only time can tell. So moving to the quotes and the pictures, firstly to talk about the country, the population is 57.7 million, obviously much smaller, about half the size of the Philippines. The GDP is actually a bit bigger at 349.4 billion, predominantly through industries such as the mining sector, which Ramaphosa did have a large influence on. And it has an area of 1.22 million kilometers squared, so quite a bit bigger, almost 4 times as big, or over 4 times as big as the Philippines. In terms of some of his quotes, things such as corruption is a big thing in the ANC. So that's a very simple quote, but I think that is something that he hopes to stand for. And someone who comes from a union background and someone who associated with Mandela and the fighting of apartheid, I think corruption is something that he is very much against. And I think that's something that I hope and I believe he'll fight against in the African Union as well. We want to renew our vows with our people. We want to reconnect with our people. We want to get our people excited. So just indicative of his strong rhetorical abilities. Land is a very broad and as well as complex issue, and it has been to be handled very delicately, because around land there is quite a lot of emotion. So just his understanding of the emotional attachment to land and the emotional drives behind people and all aspects of politics and business is always relevant, and that's why he understands it, and that's why I think he managed to grow the union so much, and I expect or hope to see him grow South Africa as well. The country is yearning to put behind all these horrible things that we have to do with corruption, that have to do with corruption. State capture behind us. I forgive you, that's not my grammar, but that's how the quote was written. So all the corruption, state capture behind us. So essentially they have to put all the corruption behind us. The sooner these things are all done, the better, because we want to move on. We want to move on to a better life. So once again, I think he very much is a good person, and I think he's very much as he was Nelson Mandela's choice. I think he really does believe in improving the lives of everyone and fighting for equality. And to put it into perspective, I think some of the criticisms that he has, been perhaps corrupt in terms of business, or some of his actions with respect to unions, or the massacre of some union employees, I think, well, one defense is, his wife is obviously the daughter of a billionaire, which is very rich, but $450 million is a lot of money, but it's not, there are many other wealthier people, there are many billionaires in South Africa, and I think one could obviously come down on them much, much harder in terms of their corruption, and also corruption is a matter of perspective as well. And just going back to Duterte's quote, that once it's mostly just because he's under the political light, and anything that he had done that might have been misaligned slightly with the morality of some people will obviously be found. So and the pictures, here's a picture of the National Union that he founded and grew, symbol of the African Union, symbol of the new South Africa, and this is a picture of Nelson Mandela. That is not him. Yeah, just to explain this picture, I didn't explain. This is obviously the picture of the Philippines for Duterte, and this is a symbol of the city of Davos, which he was the mayor of. So on to the comparison between these two great and modern living leaders. So Duterte obviously had a political upbringing in that his politics sort of ran in his family. Not only his father, his cousin, and his uncle were all mayors and provincial governor, but also supposedly related to other families that also have similar political influence. So that's important to note. Whereas Ramaphosa came from apartheid upbringing, where he was obviously structurally suppressed and even imprisoned for 11 months in solitary confinement. So perhaps maybe an easier rise for Duterte. And in terms of education, I think they're both similar in terms of quality. They both came from a legal background. However, I think Ramaphosa had a larger or a wider range of interests, as he also was involved in unions and also personal business, whereas Duterte sort of went straight into politics after his legal career. But ultimately, I think that both of these leaders, although both of them have had there's much criticism that could be applied to them, both of them might not be the perfect leaders for their country, but they are undoubtedly a fit. In Duterte's case, I think it's necessary that he be strong, and also it's necessary that he shows his strength, talk about these things or his capacity for violence, especially in terms of international relations. They need to seem strong, especially with respect to the South China Sea. He needs to appear strong, and even better, be strong. So I think that is necessary. And the Philippines did obviously have, to some extent, a lot of crime, and maybe he had gone too far in fighting it, but at least, once again, he needs to appear strong domestically, and perhaps even be strong to some extent. But I'm not advocating for killing whatsoever. I think killing is always wrong. As for Ramaphosa, once again, he might not be the perfect fit. Perhaps the charges with corruption or greed may be true, but I think it's necessary that the South African find someone who is business savvy, and that is something he is. Similarly, he also has to be someone who emphasizes with all people coming from a union or a people who are structurally suppressed before. He obviously emphasizes with the black community, which is important as from a leader, but also he understands the needs of the people in the more difficult occupations, being the past leader of a miner. But most importantly, his business acumen will, I think, make him a great fit for growing the economy of South Africa, which is obviously needed, especially given the wealth gap, as well as growing generally the economy of the African Union, where the African continent currently, as of today, has, generally speaking, had some economic difficulties relative to the other continents. So I think as a businessman, he would be definitely maybe not a perfect fit, but a great fit. And I think they are both great fits for their countries. And once again, as I said, if you think I took perhaps a too positive stance on these individuals, I accept that criticism, because I know that there's a plethora of negative information on any leader, and my sort of task and objective with this video series is to defend them and show the merit of these individuals. So that is the life of, as we know it, as of today, of Duterte and Ramaphosa. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch some of the ones I'll be making in the future. I guess just one last thing, I've never mentioned this in any of the videos before. If you notice I'm looking down, it's just because I take these notes on my paper, and just a little personal philosophy of mine. Like, I used to hate to write, but two things. Firstly, I find a really good pen. I think there should have no restriction in terms of your thoughts to writing. I think you're already contributing your thoughts. Maybe you have 5 thoughts at a time into one thing at a time. You've already lowered the bandwidth. So if you have a bad pen with poor ink that doesn't roll easily, then that's already going to slow down the bandwidth and slow down your thoughts, and then it will not be as authentic. And then also another philosophy, you can disagree with it, but write small. I think if you're writing for other people, if you're writing a note for, I don't know, a roommate or someone, you might write big note to let them know. But if you're writing for yourself, write small, I think, or find a writing style that you take pride in. I write very small because it was like a big I guess revolution in my mind, where I stopped writing for other people but started writing for myself. Right, it's so small that other individuals can't read it, and then when I started writing for myself, I became more honest with my own writing, and that's what ultimately my objective has been. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you watch some of the ones I will be making in the future and some of the ones I made in the past. Thanks so much.